Farmers aren't just competing with other farmers over the water available, but also with Australia's big cities. And just as they will have to become more water efficient, cities too will have to rethink their traditional water supply. Australian cities have long relied on its rivers for supplying the water needed, with massive dams across the country, storing 3 times the annual river flows. But during the last years of drought, dam levels hit a record low, forcing severe water restrictions on people in cities and rural areas.
That sorrel plant has survived through all the droughts. In the dry summers, I just stopped gardening.
And even though recent heavy rainfalls have brought some relief, in the long run, climate change and the rising temperatures that come with it will lead to declining river flows, says Åsa Wahlqvist.
If you look at the Murray-Darling Basin, only about 4% of the rain that falls actually ends up in the rivers. If you look at North America or Europe, it's over 50%. So if you only have 4% of the rain that falls actually going into the rivers, and you increase evaporation, you're going to have even less going into the river. Evaporation has a huge impact on river flow, and that's been one of the things we've been seeing happening over the last decade. There have been record low, beyond any expectation, levels of water in the river, and then when it rained, it was taking longer to respond than the scientists thought.
So if the rivers won't be able to provide the water needed, where else can the water come from? There are several answers to this question. In 2006, when Sydney dam levels reached a low of 36%, the authorities made a controversial decision.
The water here is basically sitting at sea level, and the screens rotate through it and we draw off it and then pump it through into the rest of the plant.
Since the beginning of 2010, the desalination plant in Kurnell turns seawater into fresh water, supplying 1.5 million Sydneysiders with water.
We're entering the pre-treatment building. Seawater is pumped up into this building where it flows down this central channel and then gets dispersed into the various cells of the pre-treatment.
Inside those cells, the water trickles through a bed of sand, leaving solids and sediment behind. It is then pumped into pressure vessels, where the actual desalination takes place.
Inside those pressure vessels there are 8 membranes in a long string, all connected together. And so the seawater passes along those membranes. They're a spiral wound membrane. Fresh water passes through the membrane and then round the spiral and comes out in the centre. So that's the pure water coming out from the vessel. The seawater concentrate comes out at the other end, again at high pressure. So there's 4,600 of these pressure vessels in the plant. This is where the desalination actually occurs, inside these pressure vessels. So it's definitely the heart of the plant.
The fresh water is then pumped to Sydney, and the concentrated seawater is released back into the ocean. This water is twice as salty and 1 degree warmer than the seawater, and gets back to normal levels within 50 meters. But not enough is known about the impact this will have on marine life.
It's perhaps a little too soon to see the sort of changes that would occur if there were to be any. So we need to monitor it over a long period. We'll monitor it over the next 3 years so that we can, we've got real evidence of the performance of that discharge and any impacts or no impacts on the marine environment.
This uncertainty over the long-term consequences on the environment is not the only issue that provoked a lot of controversy. Sydneysiders will have to pay an extra $2 every week for the purified seawater.
It costs a lot to desalinate water. In Sydney, we have a dam up above the city. It's beautiful, pristine, clean water. You can't hike or anything in the catchment area, so it's beautifully clean. And then it runs by gravity down to the city. It's so cheap. Water doesn't come cheaper than that. So it's going to cost more as we move to desalination and other methods.
Even though desalination is controversial, it is one of the few rainfall-independent sources of water. And Chris Davis thinks it's crucial to secure Sydney's future water needs.
A city like Sydney now has 15% of its average demand met by the desalination plant, which is not massive, but it helps us in a dry period. And all the capital cities are either building or have built desalination plants.
But there's another, less centralized alternative for cities to become more independent from river flows and dam water. And it's also more sustainable.
We're using that water that's made from desalinated plants once. Whereas here, I'm living like a tree. I'm continually reusing the water. You ready? I'm going to show you how to grow spuds in a small garden.
Michael Mobbs lives in a sustainable house. He collects rainwater, grows his own vegetables, and recycles all water he needs for showering and cooking. Making a house sustainable in the way Michael did costs around $25,000, but he says it was worth it.
In 14 years I've saved over 1.5 million litres of dam water, stopped over 1.5 million litres of stormwater going into Sydney Harbour, stopped over 1.5 million litres of sewage leaving the site, and my total energy and water bill savings is over $30,000.
But people like Michael are still the exception. And although more water falls on Sydney as rain than the city actually uses, most of the stormwater simply runs into the ocean. Everybody could easily make better use of this water, says journalist Åsa Wahlqvist.
The problem with Sydney's water is that people have relied upon the company Sydney Water to supply them with water. In fact, it was actually illegal until reasonably recently to put in a rainwater tank, because Sydney Water, you were depriving Sydney Water of income. I think one of the big mind shifts we need is for people to become more independent, collect more of their own rainwater, recycle more of their own water.
What people need to realise too is how easy it can be to use rainwater around their garden and house, says Michael Mobbs.
People come here and they'd say, wow, it's just like our house. So they could say, well, I just turn on the light switch and I've got solar power. I didn't know that. I thought you had to change the way you lived. There's all this myth. So my view is the only thing that brings quick change is money. When people get high water bills, they'll start to become more assertive, saying they don't want desal, they want more rainwater tanks.
Even greater barriers exist when it comes to using recycled water, as Chris Davis explains.
Recycling is still challenging for a lot of people. About 2/3 of the community typically is prepared to have recycled water put back in the drinking source. But most of those people would only accept it if it was really necessary. So in times of plentiful rain, they wouldn't accept recycling into their drinking water.
I like to suggest to people that they try growing a lettuce or a tomato bush and just think about the water used in it and start to think about the water cycle and understand that recycled water is no different from water that comes from dams. It's been through a purification process in the same way.
Australia has reached a point where a lot of uncertainty over the future of water exists. One thing is clear: global warming and the ever-increasing population will put even more pressure on existing resources. Less water will be available for everyone. For city dwellers and their household needs, for farmers and their food production. Opening up to alternative water resources is crucial and will bring some relief for the river systems. Everyone needs to start thinking about their own water footprint and realize that small changes in our daily life make a big difference. And the biggest is the invisible, the virtual water footprint, hidden in our food.